Welcome. Good morning and welcome to this discussion on increasing motivation in census test takers. I am Alexandra Price and I will be your leader in this talk today. Um, in the state of Alabama, high school juniors are required, public high school juniors are required every year, every spring, to take the ACT test. This requirement is what is known as census test taking. So, in the school system that is the focus of this particular study, traditionally the school system has not performed well. They currently have a C, and the two schools at the center of this study, one has a C and one has a D on its state report card grade. And the goal of the school system is to increase their state report card grade, and the goal of the individual schools is also to increase their state report card grade. These are both high schools, and 45% of that state report card grade depends on academic achievement and academic growth, of which the ACT is a big part of that. So, in order for the schools to improve their state report card grade, they will need to be able to improve their ACT grades of their high school juniors. The problem is that most of the students are disengaged with the content and lack the motivation to improve their ACT scores because they do not see how the test is important to them or relates to their high school plans, their post high school plans. In the school system, not every student is intended to go to a four-year college or university after school. So the goal is for this project to find a way to increase motivation in the students who do not intend to attend a four-year university or college, and hopefully have them become more motivated to participate in ACT prep and therefore help the school meet their goal of increasing their state report card grade by moving these students from level one to a higher level on the ACT of the four levels that are available. Therefore, the two research questions here at the center of this study: can relating a low interest test, such as the ACT, to a high interest test, such as the ASVAB for the military, increase motivation? And can creating a crosswalk of skills between the ASVAB math aptitude test and the ACT math subtest motivate non-college bound students to work on strengthening skills relevant to both tests, leading to increased ACT performance? In studying the literature for this study, what I found was that not one single study addressed that particular question. So, numerous studies talked about strategies to increase motivation. Numerous strategies talked about best practices for success on the high school level as far as culture and climate are concerned. Talked about student study skills. However, no studies addressed how do we increase motivation in students who do not have the intrinsic motivation to perform well on the test. Those who are headed to college afterwards are intrinsically motivated, but the students headed to the military or to a two-year institution are not intrinsically motivated to take the test. So, in doing the literature review, I created a heat map of some of the sources that I found, actually, of all of the sources. Some of them are represented here. And as you can see, most of them do not mention motivation. One does talk about motivation, and it talks about state census testing. However, it does not in any way relate the ACT to the ASVAB or how we can increase motivation in students who are not headed to a four-year university. So no studies related the two tests that are the focus of this study in the same manner. So I knew at that point that I was looking into something new, something that had not been done before. So the design that I chose for my study was a traditional grounded theory design. This type of design uses memo writing to identify themes in the data. It starts from the data rather than starting from a hypothesis. And then from the data, you develop a theory using memo writing to identify the themes and using descriptive coding to organize these memos into categories. So for the purposes of this study, I was using a mixed methods design that used some quantitative data, beginning with the student poll and ending with the student survey, but relied mainly on observational data. So since I was using descriptive data, this was the best study or the best study design for what I was looking into. So speaking of that data, I began by polling the students. If I was going to see which students were going to be the target of this poll, the target of this protocol that I was initiating, trying to get students more motivated to participate in ACT prep, and then that would translate to higher ACT performance. I needed to see where they were headed after high school. So I conducted a poll of the students, 241 total students were part of the classes in the two schools that I polled. 55 students were not part of the polled group of students for various reasons, usually has to do with their scheduling, or perhaps they were absent on that particular day. But of the ones that were polled, 54% of them responded they were going to a four-year institution. 9% said military, 26% said two-year institution, 3% said workforce, and 8% said no, had no response, as of course you cannot force them to participate in this type of thing. So the first surprise was how few students chose military as an option. I expected that number would be higher, and therefore the footprint of those students who could be potentially moved to be more motivated to participate would be higher. So that was my first sort of aha moment. Um, the other one was how many of them chose four-year institution, because 54% of the students chose four-year institution. However, if you look at the school's last year's ACT data, only 25% of the students performed above a level one. So there's a gap between how many students should be intrinsically motivated to perform well and how many actually were performing well on the test. So after the initiation of the protocol, once I completed the poll and explained to the students that what we are doing is relating the lower level 200 and 300 level college and career readiness standards that are used on the ACT to the same math standards on the ASVAB. Once I explained to them how these two things correlated to each other, and that's where our focus was going to be. For the students who were going to a four-year institution, our goal is for you to become so familiar with these standards that you reach automaticity with them on the day of the test. For the students headed to the military, the goal was, hey, you should be more motivated to participate in this because the standards that we're focusing on will also be important for you when you take the ASVAB, which is an aptitude test to determine whether or not you're suitable for the military and exactly where you would fit. So once that was explained, after the date of the initial poll, there were 6 site visits after initiation of the study protocol. And at the end of the site visits, in which we did strategies and held assessments and looked at mastery of these particular standards, students were then surveyed to determine if the protocol created a change in motivation. And as you can see, looking at the participation rates and the completion rates, which I expected both would increase, the participation rates actually stayed about the same. Except for one day on September the 11th, we had fairly low participation rates in the 80 percentile. Everything else was in the high 90s. What did show some movement was the mastery rates. And I will say the dates of the highest mastery rates were the dates when the activities that the students did were more competitive in nature, as opposed to individual or just merely cooperative sitting at your desk. The second expected result was that they would be more motivated to participate in ACT prep activities when they learn that the lower level math skills correlate to the math ASVAB. So I conducted a survey at the end to determine whether or not any change in motivation was detected. And because of the timing of the survey, I was only able to conduct this at one school. So 4 out of 5 classes at that school, 96 students were surveyed. 23% said that they were more motivated. So that was 22 students, which is more than the 16 total students that had said they were going to go to the military. So overall, we can say that the target group was reached and students were more motivated. However, because there was such a small number of students who were headed for a military career in the first place, in order for a school to really move students, they're going to need to look into other ways to motivate their students. So the significance of this is that a large portion of the state report card grade depends on the number of students at each of those four levels. So they're going to need to find ways to motivate students during census testing. So relating the ASVAB to the lower level skills did lead to some changes, but they will need to find ways to reach the other students. A significant amount of kids said that they wanted to go to a two-year school after high school. So this will not appeal to them necessarily. And it would be good for a school to find a way to motivate these students. There were some limitations of the study. I was only able to use publicly available aggregate data, so no individual student data. The study may yield different results in a different geographical area. As I said, I initially expected that more students would choose military, but that was because in my career as a high school teacher, a large number of my students actually went to the military. So I had an expectation that it would be the same here, and it was not. So that could be one factor. And the study may yield different results using a larger population. So for next steps, as I said, just to reiterate, schools need to look into a new direction to increase motivation in other census takers outside of those headed to a four-year university or headed to the military. So a potential research area could involve designing modules that are based on cooperative and competitive activities, since those seems to be the ones that the students were most motivated to complete and to master. I'd like to thank you for listening today, for joining in with me. If you have any questions, you may contact me at 233-2328 or aprice7 at aum.edu.